an instruction and exhortation to his apostles to wash one another's feet. If I have washed your feet, then you should wash one another's feet. I am thankful that is not a binding command for us today, that's not part of our gatherings. I'm not a foot guy. I wouldn't do well with that. But it was a custom and a tradition in the day, in Jesus' day. And we'll talk about that and think about that a little bit. This lesson and this scene in the life of Jesus and in his relationship with his apostles is about being a servant. It's about having the willingness to do the jobs that maybe others don't want to do. The willingness to take advantage of the opportunity to do good. And so that's kind of what we're going to be thinking about tonight. But I want to begin by kind of setting the scene and looking at this text and the story as it unfolds. So if you have your Bibles, John chapter 13, I'm actually going to begin reading in verse 3. Little background, you know this probably, but this is the night before Jesus' crucifixion. He is in the upper room with his 12 apostles. There are only the 13 men, as far as we know, in this room. They have celebrated and observed the Passover meal as directed by God in the law of Moses, and so that's kind of the scene as it unfolds. There's a lot that happens, and John records so much more of this time than any of the other gospel writers. The others talk about Jesus instituting the Lord's Supper and a couple of other little snippets from this scene, but John goes into great detail about everything that happens in the upper room on that night. And so as we begin reading in verse 3, we find Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, rose from supper and laid aside his garments, took a towel and girded himself. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with a towel with which he was girded. Then he came to Simon Peter, and Peter said to him, Lord, are you washing my feet? And Jesus answered and said to him, what I am doing you do not understand now, but you will know after this. Peter said to him, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, if I do not wash your feet, you have no part with me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. And Jesus said to him, he who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not all of you. For he knew who would betray him, therefore he said, you are not all clean. So when he had washed their feet, taken his garments, and sat down again, he said to them, do you know what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you say, well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Most assuredly I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who is sent greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. So let's think about for just a minute as we get started, in order to understand what Jesus is teaching. And Jesus has a habit of when he teaches a lesson, he doesn't just sit him down and say, okay, sit down, I want to talk to you for a minute. He has a habit of demonstrating a lesson to them. And then using that demonstration to teach them something about him or about themselves. You can see example after example after example of that. Think about the feeding of the 5,000. Or on another occasion, the feeding of the 4,000. You have these scenes where Jesus wants to teach the apostles a lesson. Much of that scene, by the way, much of that event in the feeding of the 5,000, it was not necessarily for the benefit of the crowds, other than the feeding of them because they were hungry. The real benefit was reserved for the apostles because it was those men that Jesus wanted to teach. It was those men that he was trying to prepare and was trying to mature. Why did he not just sit them down and talk to them about about His ability to meet their needs, or about their responsibility to see after the needs of others and to serve and to be available to other people? Why didn't He just sit them down and give them a lesson about those things? Because how much more impactful is it to take 5 loaves and 2 fish and feed really not 5,000 people, but probably upwards of 10,000? The 5,000 was just the men. And when you throw in women and children, you're probably at least 10,000 people. And why not make out of those 5 loaves and 2 fish exactly the right amount to fill every stomach and every mouth to its fullness and not have a single scrap left over? Why have 12 basketfuls of leftovers left at the end of the meal? Because Jesus wanted to teach His apostles that He was capable of not only doing what was needed, but of going beyond what was needed, of giving them what they needed and then some. Jesus demonstrated lessons as He taught them. And on this occasion, as these 13 men are seated around this table, Jesus sees an opportunity to teach them a very important lesson. More important even because of what He knows is about to happen. At the beginning of this text, it says, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given Him all things, and that He had come from the Father, and that He was going back to the Father. And what that text is saying is that Jesus understood what was about to happen. Jesus understood that this plan that God had put into motion way back when was about to come to fruition. That He was going to be taken by angry hands, and He was going to be beaten, and He was going to be humiliated, and He was going to be hung on a cross and killed. And He understood all of that. And so everything that He does on this night is, the importance of it is kind of multiplied, because He understands what's happening. And He knows that these men of His, these followers, these friends, these apostles, they're going to struggle. If you live in a first century world, there are a couple of things that are just part of life. One, you walk a lot. You don't have your car to hop in and drive. Most people didn't have an animal to ride on a regular basis. And so if you're going from place to place, if you're walking around town, even if you're traveling, and as Jesus, in the story we looked at earlier in John chapter 4, Jesus is traveling from Judea, which is the area of Jerusalem, to Galilee. And it's probably at least a 2-day journey by foot from Judea to Galilee. And Jesus is making that journey with His apostles. He was walking. Everywhere He went, He walked. And that was commonplace. People walked. You walk a lot if you live in that day and time. Secondly, you don't have the best of footwear. Open sandals of some shape or form. Something just to put some substance, some material between your feet and the rough road and the rocks and all the things that you're walking over. And so that's what you have. Something that's strapped to your foot to keep you from walking barefooted. The roads are dirt, dust, mud. Those 3 things put together add up to dirty feet, right? And so it was common practice. If you come to my house and I have dinner prepared and I'm going to have you over for dinner, you come to my house and the first thing you do, the very first thing you do as you come into my house is you take your sandals off, and I have one of my hired servants there, and that hired servant has a basin of water and a towel, and they're going to wash your feet. It's a sign of hospitality, but it also has a very practical purpose. Your feet are dirty, and they need to be washed. Keep in mind also that when we sit down to the table to eat, we're not sitting in chairs that are scooted up and our legs are underneath the table and we're sitting up here eating. Their tables in that day and time were no more than 6 inches off the floor. When you read in the Scriptures that they reclined at the table, that word is used, that idea is used because they would lay beside the table, usually maybe propped on one elbow, as they ate their food. And so when you do that, there's nowhere to hide your feet. You can't throw your feet under the table so nobody sees them. And so you see these 13 men gathered around this table. Everything has been prepared. The room has been prepared. The meal was prepared. And they come into this room to eat the Passover meal and spend this time together. And they come in, and if you can imagine the scene, and we're going to fill in some blanks here, and we can do this without doing any damage to the text. But they come into the room. They see everything set up. Here's the table. The meal's ready. Everything is prepared. But I'm looking around. Where's the servant? Where's the servant? There's supposed to be somebody standing at the door to wash our feet. Where is he? He's not there. And so after looking around and not finding him, we decide finally, well, let's go ahead and go sit down, I guess. And so they go and they recline at the table. And they're all reclined around this table with their dirty feet. There was probably some grumbling and some mumbling going on. You know, Peter's feet stink, and James never clips his toenails, and I don't know what Thaddeus has going on over there. And, you know, you have these thoughts and these words and these comments, and everybody's a little upset that somebody dropped the ball. Somebody dropped the ball and didn't get someone to come in to wash our feet. There's supposed to be somebody there to do that. It's just common courtesy. It's just what you do. The text says, and I read from the New King James Version. The New King James reads, after supper, or supper being ended. That's probably not the most accurate translation. If you're reading from maybe the ESV or some other translation, it probably says during dinner or during supper. And that's probably a better translation. In the middle of the meal, as they are eating this meal together, amidst all the whispers and the grumbling and the mumbling about the dirty feet, and somebody dropped the ball and nobody did their job, and Jesus, maybe without a word even, nothing's recorded that he says, he just gets up. What's he doing? Where's Jesus going? And he goes over to the corner of a room where there is a basin. As the room was prepared, the table was set. Made sure there were enough dishes and enough cups and everything that was needed. And as part of preparing the room, the owner of the house would have made sure that there was a basin there for the washing of feet. That's just part of the process. And so Jesus goes and gets that basin and puts some water in it and wraps a towel around himself and begins to make his way around the room. He begins to wash their feet. Understand this, it's too late for this. This was supposed to have been done long before now. This isn't supposed to be done during the meal. It's supposed to be done at the very beginning when you first come into the house. It's too late. But Jesus does it anyway. And maybe already you begin to see the point that Jesus is going to make to his apostles. Without asking the question, he kind of puts it out there in the air, in the room. Why didn't somebody do this? When you came in and saw that there was nobody here, why didn't somebody do it? When you knew that your feet and everybody else's feet, including Jesus' feet, needed to be washed, why didn't somebody go get the basin, get the water, get the towel, and do the job? And the fact of the matter is that probably the answer to that question is nobody in that room felt like it was their job to do. Everybody in that room probably felt like it was beneath them. You see, even among the hired servants, even among the staff of a house and those who served in a house, that job, the washing of feet, was reserved for the guy at the bottom of the totem pole. The guy with the least amount of seniority, the guy with the least amount of respect or regard, he was the one who got that job. Nobody, even the servants, didn't want that job. Why would the apostles stoop to take on that responsibility? It's somebody else's job. And so it is that scene that Jesus puts together for the apostles to teach them about being servants. Because think about what's about to happen. Jesus is about to be crucified. 3 days later, He's going to be raised from the dead. He's going to spend a little bit of time after that in this world, but then He's going to ascend back to the Father. And the apostles are going to go to Jerusalem to wait for the coming of the Comforter, or the Spirit of Truth, as Jesus will call Him, on this night. And on the day of Pentecost, that's going to happen. And they're going to begin to preach the gospel, and the church is going to be born. And now they are, excuse the term here, but they are the big dogs. They're the apostles. And it's very easy, because although a lot has changed in 20 centuries, and our world is very much different than theirs, human nature really hasn't changed a whole lot. And it is very easy when we are put in a position of authority, or we're put in a position of notoriety, it is very easy for us to begin to think that certain things are beneath us. And that's not my job. That's somebody else's job. And Jesus needed to make sure that they understood that it is your job. It's your job to be a servant. Whatever that means, it's your job to be a servant. And so what Jesus teaches them on this night in a very humbling way is how to be a servant. He teaches them to wash one another's feet. And He doesn't mean just wash their feet. He means serve in whatever way is needed. I know a man who is a faithful member of the Lord's church, and he's in the area where I grew up, and where I also preached as a preacher for the first time, my first full-time work as a minister. And he was a great encouragement to me. He wasn't at that congregation, but he did some things for me that were very helpful. This man was a millionaire several times over. He had a very successful business, manufacturing business, and had done very well in that. And then when he decided to retire, he sold that business for multi-million dollars and had a lot of money. But if you wanted to find him, his name was Gerald, and if you wanted to find Gerald, pretty much any day of the week, at least Monday through Friday, you know where you could find him? You could find him at the church building. And you would find him dressed, if you saw him walking around the halls, you would assume that he was a janitor, because that's the way he was dressed, in his khaki pants and his khaki shirt and his big ring of keys on his hip. And anything that needed to be fixed, if there was a leaky faucet, or if there was a place on the wall that had been dinged up and needed to be repaired and painted, if there was something that needed to be done, he was there just to do whatever needed to be done. And this man who had been a very successful businessman and was a multimillionaire showed up at the church building to serve every day. And I think that's what Jesus calls all of us to be in whatever way that we can. What I want to think with you about tonight for just the next few minutes, and we've talked about this story, and hopefully you have seen this scene, maybe a little more clearly than you've seen it before. But very quickly, in just the 10 or 15 minutes that are left, I want to think about some very simple things that are involved in what Jesus was telling His apostles to be, and what He is telling us to be. And I did this by asking the question, whoops, I'll get there in a minute. Do you have what it takes? Do you have what it takes to be a foot washer? And I think in this scene on the night before Jesus' crucifixion, Jesus was making the point to His apostles that you've got to have what it takes to be a foot washer. Well, what does it take to be a foot washer? Well, first of all, it takes humility. You can't have this attitude that job is beneath me. Serving that person or serving in that way is beneath me. You've got to be humble enough to say, if it needs doing, I will do it. And that's what being a servant is about. It is about understanding that when there is a job that needs to be done, it needs to be done. And it doesn't matter who does it. Is it an elder or an elder's wife? Is it a deacon or a deacon's wife? Is it the preacher? Is it someone who has a very successful life out in the world, in the business world, or whatever? Is it a young person? No job is too small, right, or insignificant. We need to be humble. We need to be humble enough. I'm doing this wrong. There we go. I got it right now. We need to be humble enough to submit to God's will. I need to be humble enough to understand that when God says, do this, I'm willing to do this. And not be haughty in my own spirit and in my own mind that I know what I need and what is best for me. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 6, Peter says, therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you in due time. So often, and our world teaches us this. Our world teaches us to exalt ourselves. If you don't lift yourself up, if you don't talk good about yourself, if you don't tell everybody what you've done and how successful you've been, then who's going to do it? Exalt yourself. And yet God says, you humble yourself, and God will exalt you in due time. Humble enough to submit to God's will. Secondly, we need to be humble enough to serve others. Humble enough to get our hands dirty. Humble enough to do the work that needs to be done, whatever that is. I've got a reference here of Romans chapter 12, verses 3 through 21. I'm not going to read all of that, but what Paul is writing about in that text is generally how you and I need to behave as Christians in this world. How we need to conduct ourselves. What kind of attitude we need to have. How we need to act toward others. And I want to point out, I think, 3 verses out of all that text and read them real quickly. Verse 3, Paul says, for I say through the grace given to me to whoever is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. Verse 10, be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor, giving preference to one another. Verse 15 and 16, rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. If we're going to be foot washers in the metaphorical sense, if we're going to be the servants that Jesus tried to teach us to be, we've got to have humility. Enough humility to submit to God. Enough humility to serve others. Secondly, we've got to have selflessness. Selflessness, you may say, well, that's pretty much the same thing as humility, isn't it? And yes, it's closely related. But I like to think about it this way. Selflessness is humility that is focused outward. See, humility is what we are on the inside. It's how we look at ourselves. Selflessness is how that humility causes us to look out at others. Selflessness is how we perceive other people. Are they worthy of my time? Are they worthy of my attention? Are they worthy of my work and my effort and my service? Hebrews 10:24, the Hebrew writer says, and let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works. Think about each other, he says. And then in another text, and Paul says in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10, therefore as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially those who are the household of faith. Back up to the beginning of that verse. As we have opportunity. Every time we have the opportunity. Yes, sometimes it's going to be inconvenient. Yes, sometimes it's going to be a harder job than we really wanted to do that day. Yes, we wanted to, it might be something that may even cost us a little bit of money. But as we have opportunity, let us do good. Selflessness is humility focused outward. Selflessness is putting others before self. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 24, Paul says, "Let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being." Think about real quickly with me the context of that statement. I don't want to just jerk it out of its context and use it, but when you look at the context, and first of all, when you think about the letter as a whole, the letter of 1 Corinthians, you find Paul writing to a group of people who aren't getting along. They don't really act like they like each other very much. They're fighting a lot. They're squabbling. There is strife among them. They're trying to put themselves above others, and they're doing all kinds of things that are showing disrespect and a lack of love for one another. And that's really pretty much everything Paul deals with in that letter. If you go through and look at all the different issues he deals with, every one of them boils down to that. It boils down to a lack of love. And that's why in chapter 13, and we'll look at some of those verses in a minute, in chapter 13, he's going to talk to them about what love really is and what it really looks like. All right, so that's the whole context. In chapter 10, Paul's dealing with a particular issue. There are some who are disrespecting others over this issue of meat sacrificed to idols. And we don't have time to go into all that. Hopefully, you have some knowledge of that. Romans 14, 1 Corinthians 10, kind of the same issue is dealt with there. And there were some who found it offensive to eat or to serve meat that had been sacrificed to idols, and some others just saw it as meat and nothing special about it. And so how do you deal with that? When you've got some in the congregation, this group over here says, that meat's offensive, it was sacrificed to idols, we're not supposed to have anything to do with it. And this group over here says, it's just meat. I'm going to give thanks for it. I'm going to put it on the table. My family's going to eat it. No big deal. And Paul says, I would put myself in this group, right? And Paul says, I am convinced that everything that is taken with thanksgiving is clean or is okay. But there's this group over here. And so what do you do with this group over here? And so what he says is, all right, you guys, you don't have a problem eating this meat, but here's what you need to understand. They do. And so if you have them over to your house, do not set that meat in front of them. That's just completely unloving and disrespectful. If you want to have it in the privacy of your home with your family, that's fine, no problem. But don't invite them over to your house and put that meat in front of them. Don't take that dish of meat to the fellowship meal at church because you know they're going to be there. And to this group, he says, now look, they don't have a problem with this, and that's okay. And so if you don't want to eat this meat and you think it's offensive, that's fine. Don't eat it. Obey and follow your conscience in that matter. But don't judge them and condemn them when you know they're doing something in the privacy of their own home that is a violation of your conscience. And so what he's really saying to both groups is what you read in verse 24. He's saying, let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. In other words, think about the other person. Think about what they need. And be willing to skip that meat if you know that's going to be best for someone else. Be willing to do that thing of service, that act of service. Be willing to reach out to someone else. Be willing to turn the other cheek. Be willing, whatever you want to put in the blank there, if that's what is helpful to someone else. Selflessness, humility focused outward. Jesus, as he looks around that table at those 12 men, he sees people who maybe were looking at each other thinking, well, why didn't he do it? Or why didn't he do it? And Jesus says, why didn't you do it? Because you weren't humble enough to do it. And because you weren't selfless enough to do it. And you've got to learn to be humble, and you've got to learn to be selfless. And to us, he says, you've got to learn to be humble, and you've got to learn to be selfless if you want to be servants. One other thing, and that is love. If you want to be a servant, you've got to love. One of the things that Jesus did when he came into this world and showed us who God was and through his life is He showed us what, you're familiar with the term agape. He showed us what agape love looks like. Agape love is an unselfish love. And agape love is a love that puts someone else first. It's a selfless love. It's a love that wants what's best for someone else, for the other person. And Jesus showed us maybe in a way that we had never seen before what that kind of love looked like in real life. And He says to His apostles, if you want to be a servant, you've got to love. You've got to love your brother enough to get down there and wash his feet. You've got to love that person enough to spend some time and to make some effort to help when they need it. In Galatians 6 and verse 2, Paul, as he talks about restoring those who are away from the truth, he says in verse 2, bear one another's burden and so fulfill the law of Christ. That phrase, bear one another's burden, is kind of a word picture. And here's the picture that it paints. It paints a picture of someone who's trying to carry a load that's too heavy for them. And so if you can imagine someone with this big load and they're carrying it and they're here and here, and they can't quite carry it by themselves. And so the picture or the word or the phrase paints a picture of you coming up behind them and taking the back end of that load so that together you can carry it. And that load he's talking about is some spiritual struggle. And so he's saying through your prayers and through your encouragement and through your help to carry the load that someone else carries. And if we're going to be true servants, we have to love our brethren enough. We have to love people enough to be willing to help carry the load. You got to love them enough to be willing to wash their feet. Love. Going back, I mentioned 1 Corinthians 13 a minute ago. As Paul begins that, and we look at 1 Corinthians 13 and we think, oh, this is such a beautiful and sweet text. You know, you hear it read a lot at weddings maybe or other situations like that. And understand that's not the tone of this chapter at all. As Paul writes this chapter on love, he is, to put real simply, he's chewing out the Corinthians. He's saying you don't love each other. Let me show you let me tell you what love looks like. In verses 1 through 3, he says, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not love, I've become as a sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I can remove mountains but have not love, I'm nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned but have not love, it profits me nothing. You hear what he's saying? He's saying it doesn't matter how many good things you do. It doesn't matter how talented you are. It doesn't matter how well you're known or how much you're respected. If you don't have love as the motivator for what you're doing and why you're doing it, then there is no profit in what you are doing. Love is vital. You can do all the right things, but if you don't do it with love, you're just checking boxes. Have you ever been in a position where you did something for someone, but you did it with a terrible attitude? You didn't want to be there. You didn't want to. There was somewhere else you'd rather be. There's something else you'd rather be doing. You're kind of angry. You're kind of bitter. You're frustrated, and you're doing the job, but the whole time you're just fussing somewhere in your brain. And that's what Paul's talking about. We need love. Serve one another with love. Galatians 5, verses 13 and 14. Paul says, for you, brethren, have been called to liberty. Only do not use liberty as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Through love, serve one another. And on that night, around that table, Jesus was teaching his apostles to be humble and to be selfless and to love to the extent that you're willing to wash one another's feet, to the extent that you're willing to do whatever needs to be done to serve in whatever capacity you need to serve. As we conclude, Paul says this about Jesus in Philippians chapter 2, beginning in verse 5. Let this mind be in you. Have this attitude, have this mindset in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, or did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped or held on to, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant, and coming in the likeness of men. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. Jesus was a servant. Yes, he was the Son of God, God in the flesh, with the power to heal and the power to raise the dead and the power to calm the seas and the storm. But Jesus was a servant by choice. Paul describes his humility in leaving the glory of heaven and coming to this world, to submitting himself to the Father. His selflessness in becoming a servant and giving himself even to the point of death. And his love, the thing that motivated it all. Jesus was what he taught us to be, a servant. And so this idea of washing one another's feet, it's really the idea of serving. However, whenever, and whoever you can. Let's close with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we are so very thankful to you for this night. We're thankful, Father, for this time that we've had together. We're thankful for each and every one who is represented here and for this good congregation and the work that they're doing in this community. Father, we are thankful for the opportunity to be your children and for the opportunity to be servants. Help us, Father, to be humble. Help us to submit to you and to be willing to serve others. Help us to be selfless, to put others before ourselves and to look for those opportunities to do good. Help us, Father, to love. Help us to love our fellow man. Help us to love our brethren. Help us, Father, to love you more. Thank you most of all, God, for your Son, for his example, for his teaching, and for his death and resurrection. Thank you for all that we have because he chose to come into this world and to live and to die and to overcome death. Thank you for hope. Thank you for forgiveness. Thank you for salvation. All these things we ask and pray in Christ's name. Amen.
Thank you. Let me just take a second here and thank Rusty for coming tonight. Please make sure you give him a shake his hand, and express your thanks as well. One other